Hey, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're watching the video version or listening to the audio podcast version of Hypnosis Week. It's me, as always, by birth, Alex William Smith, but better known to many of you as the British bad boy of hypnosis, Jonathan Royal of magicalguru.com, and I've got a wonderful guest for you, as always, only the best of the best on this show, who has just launched a new book that we're going to be talking about. So, look, I'm not going to beat around the bush. All I'm going to say, you can see that on screen. The book, hold it up again. I haven't introduced you yet, but hold it up. People can see it. The book is called Transgender, as you can see, and subtitled Working with Transgender Clients in a Professional Hypnosis Practice. This one's going to be, no doubt, slightly controversial. It shouldn't be, but some people will see this as slightly controversial. And those people are probably complete bigoted, racist, homophobic dickheads. Yeah, I purposely, I was going to actually, for the background, before I introduce my guest, I was going to use this background because that is the trans flag. I didn't for the reasons, well, two reasons. One, it makes me look a bit fuzzier around the head. That's one of the reasons. And the other is that I thought, you know what? It's Pride Month, so let's have the Pride flag, because we're doing this on the 4th of June 2024, but this is something that's affected people forever in history and will do into the future. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the author of Transgender, Working with Transgender Clients in a Professional Hypnosis Practice, the man himself that you see at the side of me, depending on where you see this or you hear, will hear in a moment, Mr. Christian, and I hope I pronounce this right, Skoorsmith, is that right?
Skoorsmith, yes, Skoorsmith.
Tremendous. Welcome to the show, Christian. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Hey, thank you for coming on. Well, the only things I'm going to mention before we get down to the first question that I ask everybody, which is your origin story that brought you to this point of writing this book, is that for the, just so it's out there, because people, viewers and listeners who are new to this show may not realize that I do play devil's advocate sometimes. But I want to make it straight up front that Pride Month, I am fully a friend of everyone, whether LGBTQ plus, I think is enough. There's too many letters now. I think that plus, I can't remember them all. And that's not meant in an offensive manner, but I think that LGBTQ plus is inclusive enough just for the purposes of this. And that in terms of transgender people, for anyone who may not realize, we are talking about people who were born with male genitalia, but felt like that they were female and have transitioned and become as autonomically is possible, as much as is possible, female. So, yeah, that means the men have had it removed. Well, not fully removed, but altered and parts removed. And it can work the other way as well. People born with female anatomy, feeling that they are more male, gender-wise and attributes-wise, and doing that which is necessary. Yep, the girlfriend's had her tits removed, and now she's left me flat, which should be brown with one side. But it is literally transitioning. That's what that word means. And for the record, this is mentioned in my autobiography, so it's not anyone who's bothered to look at that or followed me over the years will already know. But for the record, I have in the past had three girlfriends who were born male. But when I was having a relationship with them, they were female. I'm just putting that out there from where I come from. My daughter's godfather is gay and married. I have family connections, friendship connections with all elements of the LGBT Q plus and all the other letters community. But I may at points during this interview come across as low. I don't if I'm purposely playing devil's advocate. I just wanted to get that out there. No more from me. What brought you on this journey, Christian, to get to where you are today?
Fantastic. Well, so before I jump into that story, just a couple points of clarification. And it might have been just joking about anyone who doesn't agree or approve or has questions about this topic. They're not necessarily bigoted or racist or homophobic. I mean, those people are probably not going to listen to this podcast.
There are people that are curious as well, I know, but I was slightly tongue-in-cheek, but there again, sadly, the highest percentage of people probably do fall into that category, I'm afraid.
There's a great difficulty in our civilization at present around this issue. But I also have a lot of well-meaning people who are interested and have genuine questions about it. And so this is why I love to have a conversation like this, so we can actually talk about that.
Well, I genuinely hope that some of the things in this interview will prompt people to go and get your book. Whether that's for them to work with clients or whether that's just to clarify things for themselves and then potentially change their viewpoints and opinions.
Yes. I hope that the book can serve both of those points. One other just note of clarification is that for me, when I talk about transgender identity, there's the whole scope of anyone who doesn't identify with the gender identity that was assigned to them at birth. So they could have medically transitioned. They could not. They can socially transition. There's all kinds of different ways that people can be transgender. But I don't want to limit that expression to only people who have completely medically transitioned, because that's not that's not for everybody for various reasons. And all of the kinds of expression that one can have, which is increasingly diverse day by day, it seems like. That those I would also
some of them, and this is just my opinion, some of them are fucking ridiculous. There are people now who, frankly, I think need therapeutic help to get over their attention-seeking tendencies, who are saying they identify as a fucking flower, and ridiculous things like that. You see people on social media. That is taking the piss, and in my opinion, detracting from people who are serious. And
yes. Well, I don't have plans for a book on trans species hypnosis. Yeah. Well, okay. So my particular story. I actually, so I'm a cisgendered male, which means I identify with the gender identity that was assigned to me at birth. However ill-fitting, however awkward that's been, I've never, it's never been a full-fledged, I've never been really leaning into that, but it more or less, that's who I identify with. So I'm cisgendered. So when I talk about these issues, I speak about them not as a member of the transgender community, but as an ally, and also somebody I speak primarily to other cisgendered clinicians, because we have that same background, right? We have the same kind of questions, and we came from that same background. And 15 years ago, I was much in that space where I only had sort of like the very general sort of like sort of background knowledge that most people have just by being in the culture, which, frankly, as you've said, is not very good. It's not very exhaustive. It's not very accurate. It's not very helpful. And so I had some close family members. I don't want to say who, just because it's their story to tell, but some very close family members, several of them, more than one of them, that were going through. They were expressing this desire, this identity, and walking through with that process with them in a very, very close relationship. It really brought my wife and I, my family, into exposure relationship with that community. And it was such a tremendous experience. that it really informed who we are as people, as individuals, as a family, and also at the same time, I was also transitioning into transitioning, not being a, there's no joke there. I was just a word I use. I was becoming a hypnotist. I was exploring hypnotherapy. I was leaning into that side of clinical work, and so it was natural for me to, like, in that context, since both of those conversations were buzzing in my head, that I felt like that's where I wanted to, that would be one of the places where I wanted to apply these principles. I really wanted to make my practice a safe space and a helpful space for transgender clients, particularly. And I live in Seattle, Washington, and the Pacific Northwest of the United States is a fairly progressive region, and Seattle particularly is very LGBTQ plus friendly, and so it was a really good space for me to do that. And for a while, I was the only clinician that was expressly trans friendly. Thankfully, that's not the case anymore. But for a number of years, that was the case. And so I started doing that, and then working with other hypnotists, hypnotherapists, clinicians, coaches. I recognized that, like, in these conferences, we didn't have any of those conversations. It was all about, NLP or techniques or whatnot, and it wasn't. We weren't having a conversation about, like, LGBTQ orientation and how that affects the work we do. So I started pitching presentations about the topic of working with transgender clients, particularly. And it picked up steam. More and more conferences wanted it, and then the audience started getting bigger and bigger. People really came with a lot of really intense conversations, the questions, and I offered them all over the United States, in Australia, and so over the course of about 8 or 9 years of giving these presentations, I collected so many perspectives, so many questions, that it was really time for me to put it into a book. And so I just sat down and within a week produced the bulk of the original manuscript. I mean, it took 9 years to write the book, right? Because it was all research, but, like, actually just typing it out, I just wrote it out like I was speaking. So it's written in a very sort of conversational style. And it was an opportunity for me to say everything I wanted to say about all these topics, but because of the constraints of time and specific focuses of different conferences and whatnot, that I didn't get a chance to say everything I wanted. But now in the book, I got a chance to really lean into that experience, that conversation, and really share all of that and open up some of those questions. And it was a really great experience for me too. And as I said, it's written from a cisgender perspective, primarily with in mind an audience of cisgender practitioners. But I had a trans man editor, and he was saying that he thinks, and he's also a hypnotherapist, and he thinks that it would be something that even trans people and trans clinicians would find benefit in reading. So that's good. I mean, it's good to hear. And so I had sort of needed to change some of the language. But generally, the orientation is really, I think, in my mind, toward people that don't know much about the transgender world. So have I answered the question? Okay.
Yeah. These may not necessarily be in the order you deal with them in the book. It's just the order that they'll come out. So basically what I'm saying is, viewers and listeners, it's probably going to be far more coherent for you in terms of a logical order. You get a copy of Christian's book from the link below the video or the audio podcast and read it in what will probably be a far better order. But this is kind of the things that jump into my mind as viewers. I go off on one on tangent. Now, you're looking at it from this male, from the point of view of a male, physically born as a male, identified mostly as a male. And obviously there are people out there who fall into the transgender label that you have helped, because that's where you've got the experience, the knowledge, and the insights from. So obviously there are people, whether born physically male, transitioning to female, or vice versa, that are happy and comfortable to go and see a therapist who is male by birth and identifies as male, or is female by birth and identifies as female. I imagine, however, that there would be, and I don't know how large that category would be, but I imagine there would be perhaps a lot of transgender people that if they were, for example, born physically male and were transitioning to female, or vice versa, will perhaps feel more logically comfortable going to see a practitioner who themselves had transitioned in the direction that they were doing. If that makes sense. What would you thought?
Yeah. Well, so I would agree. I mean, certainly, I think in most sort of therapeutic contexts, we would always feel more comfortable with someone who's had the same kind of life experience that we had, the same kind of background,
Yeah.
right? And so part of it, I think, is just simply availability, right? That there's not that many. There are transgender hypnotists.
But not a big amount.
Yeah, but not very many. Yeah. Probably the same proportion that there are in the general population. So you know, and that differs depending on how you define it and how you measure it. But it's between like 0.2% of the population up to maybe 2 or 3% of the population. So regardless, not very many. And none that I know of in the Seattle area, at least none that I know are out, or that are
to be honest, off the top of my head, the only and there will be more than this, of course, and it's not something for viewers or listeners. Don't bombard me with emails going, if you'd spent a little bit longer on Google, you would have had. I haven't even Googled, but I'm sure if you Google transgender hypnotherapist, for example, that you would find people around the world. But the only person that jumps to my mind is a lady called Tracy, Tracie, or Keefe, Keefe, who is based in Australia and has a number of books out on various different hypno-related subjects. So yeah, without a doubt, in the minority, unfortunately, at the moment. Hopefully your book may actually help encourage people to you know, get into it and increase the numbers.
Well, so I guess that would be the second sort of half of the answer, would be that like I think virtually everybody, while we might prefer somebody who has a very, very similar experience as ours, right? They speak the same language, right? There's all kinds of benefits for that. But that if that's not possible, what the really important thing is if somebody knows about that experience, knows that language, knows the issues, knows what the general complications or the issues, the stresses are. And so I want to make sure that we're also clear that transgender people are people as well as transgender, right? So actually the book has different chapters on how to help transgender clients through the process of transitioning. However, that, you know, there's many different ways that transitioning takes place, and those issues. But there's also a chapter on how you help transgender people just generally, and what those dynamics might be, because transgender people are also people that need to lose weight or quit smoking, or have trauma, have stresses, need anger management, right? They're people. So it's not as if I'm only thinking of transgender experience being the experience of transitioning.
We're getting into the realms here of using people may not fully transition, for example, and yet because they identify as female or male, are going to feel more respected and valued when the pronouns that go with the identity they identify as, but yet may not fully transitioned into. And I guess that therapy is far more likely to work for them, whatever therapeutic techniques, when there is not the resistance or that little voice in their head going, Why can't they just refer to me as, you know, her or she, or when
Yeah.
talking about remembering things from the.
Yeah, yeah,
Can you
yeah.
elaborate on those things a bit?
Yeah, pronouns and age regression is something that I talk about specifically, and like, and the dynamics of that, and how do we, generally the importance of using the pronoun that the person wants you to use. But in the age regression, there's some specific dynamics about like whether that gets retroactively applied to earlier iterations of oneself, and those, you know, those kinds of questions. And like basically the bottom line is let the client lead. But there are things that we can be aware of ahead of time so that we're sensitive to whether there's questions there or not. And that's so, like, if you're going to just summarize the book, it would be let the client lead. But it really helps for a clinician to know generally the language, the general issues, and the dynamics, what the expected stressors are, so that we can be prepared to not just be, you know, surprised or blown away or intrigued, that we can actually be present for the client. So let me just, this might help explain why I'm thinking this way. So the first chapter it's basically four chapters. The first chapter is a discussion of what it means, what transgender means, and so it actually goes into quite an extensive sort of reflection on identity, gender identity. We talk about chromosomes and brain structure. We talk about cisgender identity. We talk about lots of stuff in that chapter, and so really, I'm really quite pleased with that chapter. And then the second chapter talks about how to help clients through transition, gender transition, and those various, because there's social transitioning, where it's mostly like name, pronoun, how they dress, how they move in the world. There's legal transitioning, where you're changing like birth documents, driver's license, you know, mortgages, you know, those like college degrees, those kinds of things. And then there's the medical transitioning that you were referencing, which might include like hormone treatment, or limited kinds of medical interventions like surgeries, or multiple surgeries, maybe plastic surgery or voice box. I mean, there's all kinds of different aspects of that. And then the third chapter is what I was talking about, like how do you help transition, or how do you help transgender clients generally? And it's helpful, like, even though, you know, if you're trying to help a transgender client quit smoking, you know, you help them in the way you help everybody, but it's helpful to know what the particular stressors are, and also what the particular advantages, benefits, strengths that transgender people typically bring to therapy. It's helpful to have that in context as well. And because you might also crop up without you knowing it, and you need to be prepared for that, or at least be able to have that conversation. And then the fourth chapter is actually for cisgender clientele, or cisgender clinicians or hypnotherapists, hypnotists, and that chapter is about how it's actually beneficial for us to work with transgender clients, because it's important that, like, we not think of it just being us unilaterally affecting other people, but we actually are reflexively also engaging in our own work, our own gender identity, our own explorations of our own prejudices and misgivings and impulses, so that we're able to show up without being triggered as well. So I think the fourth chapter was something new that actually was brought up through conversations with actually transgender clinicians, about, like, where's the joy in working with transgender clients. So those are the four. That's the sort of the spectrum of what the book is talking about.
I mean, from my point of view, crikey, therapists were supposed to be accepting and non-judgmental, and that shouldn't matter on what the person's age, race, sex, color, religion, or gender is. Sadly, unfortunately, that doesn't always carry itself into the real world around us, unfortunately. But that is what we're supposed to ideally be doing as therapists, is be a non-judgmental sounding board or guiding light out the individual, however they identify, to achieve whatever goal or desire or feeling or outcome it is that they come to us wanting to find.
That's key. Yes. Like we're there to help them achieve their goals, right? Not to fit into whatever
Hmm.
box we want them to. Yeah. Well, but so, and I think that's yes, amen to that. And also that as people, as you know, therapists, we know we have our own baggage. We have our own
Of
things. As
course.
much as we try to overcome them, it's really important that we do that work deliberately, that we don't shy away from the reactions that we're having because we feel like they're shameful or we shouldn't have them. We need to actually dial down on that and figure out what's going on in there so we can set that aside, so we can show up non-judgmentally for our
I
client.
think there will be some people who watch or listen to, they may never admit to what I'm about to say, and I don't expect them to either. But I suspect there will be some therapists out there, whether male or female, identifying or cis, doesn't particularly matter, who haven't necessarily. How can I put it? What I'm trying to say is that I believe that not necessarily all, but my gut instinct is that a large percentage of people who might at first sight come across as being anti-trans or anti-gay or anti-quit or whatever, it's a knee-jerk reaction to try and avoid them having to perhaps examine some feelings they may have had within themselves. And I'm not saying that that individual is repressed homosexual or actually was born a male and deep down wants to become female. No, of course I'm not saying that. But I do believe, and it seems logical to me as well, that as we all in the womb, when the sperm connects with the egg, up to a certain point, we are all female. Well, we're all nothing, and then we're all fit, and then some become biologically male. So it seems to me as anything can go wrong sometimes. Purely logical that some people are going to end up being born physically male when they psychologically, emotionally, and on all other levels identify as female, and vice versa. It just seems logical to me that that's likely to happen. And it seems logical to me, and I know this is just my opinion that I'm expressing, that we are all, I believe genuinely, I believe that we're all at heart bisexual. Or we have the potential to be. It's just that whether it's, and we're not going to get into the whole nature or nurture bloody debate, but that for whatever reasons, we all at heart start off the same, but then for whatever reason, some elements in some people become stronger. But that is also natural. You see that in the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom. That is nature. That is natural. And so my point is that this isn't something that people who perhaps within themselves haven't yet identified it, so the knee-jerk reaction go, no, that's right. It isn't something unnatural to be feared. It's something completely natural to be embraced. Hopefully that made sense. I know what I'm trying to say, but it doesn't always come out.
Well, so what I like, so yes, I think that's, you landed on a really good spot. At the beginning, you said you can understand, like, it's perfectly logical how things can go wrong, right? And that's how, like, our language sort of creeps in with these judgments we didn't recognize going wrong, like assuming that then like transgender is somehow wrong, right? That it's like the mismatch.
That's most definitely not what I meant. I just meant that
I know, yes, I know, but
the physical
I
outcome
totally
didn't
feel
go
that.
the way that matched with the psychological. You know?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, and so yeah, I think there's certainly a conversation to be had about projection, right? And it doesn't necessarily, like you said, it doesn't have to be projection of that latent quality, but also projection of whatever discomfort we're having. Maybe it's a discomfort that we haven't addressed these questions, or that some other sort of like associated feeling or quality that we have inside of us, or our willingness to express those things, like whatever it is. Our discomfort oftentimes about somebody else's identity says more about our our own psychology, right, than it does about whatever they are. Right? And I think that's a really good point. And then one other thing you said actually was sort of piqued my interest, my curiosity, it grabbed my ear, was when you were talking about all of us being born bisexual. And so that's a really great sort of like analogy. And one of the things that we want to be able to tease apart when we're talking about transgender issues is that there is, like, since they're all LGBT, right, there's sort of this assumption that they're all the same sort of category. Whereas being gay or lesbian or bisexual, those are all sexual orientations, as opposed to being transgender, which is gender identity, right? So one is about sexual activity and who we're attracted to, and the other one is about how we see ourselves in the world and embodied. And they're not entirely unrelated, right? But they're not the same. They're not the same thing. And one of the things I talked about in the book a couple of times is that this distinction is really important to make, because when we're dealing with, especially when we're dealing with children, like young children who are sexually active or sexually aware, right? Little kids can be aware of their gender as early as a few months, like as early as 18 months in some studies, but generally around 2, or then start, like when they start going to kindergarten and 4 and 5, kids are becoming more aware of gender identity. And so they can be aware of how they are identifying or feeling or having questions about that, where questions of like sexual activity or orientation or desire, right, that would not be appropriate at those ages. Yeah.
And in terms of children, some will find this controversial, but and I will point out, because I play devil's advocate, this is actually genuinely, this one is one that's genuinely my feeling on it, is that Welsh children should obviously be helped, supported, and in any way possible. I personally do not feel that there should be any form of surgical or chemical intervention offered to children. And by children, I mean, if you've not reached the age of sexual consent, you should not, no doctor or psychiatrist out there should be signing off saying you can have surgery or be given drugs that can alter your body. Because until you reach, and there's a lot of debate on this and nobody knows for certain, so I would say it's always best to play on the side of safety. But Sigmund Freud said that the formative years were 0 to 7. If you take what he meant by formative years further, perhaps he didn't mean this, but if we look at the critical faculty analytical area, or as psychologists call it, the executive function, that does not, it seems, it does not fully develop until past puberty, until puberty has passed. So with that in mind,
sometimes as late as 25 years old.
Exactly, some people, but you've got to draw a line somewhere. So if someone can legally have sex, legally vote, and legally do all these other things, then we kind of, whether I agree with it or not, got to go, that's the benchmark. Personally, I would probably say, in England, age of consent for sex is 16. However, you can't buy alcohol till you're 18. So I would argue that making life-changing decisions like surgical interventions should be 18. But that's an entire debate. Some people agree with me. Some will absolutely hate me for saying it. Please just remember, I am an ally, I am a friend, but I do genuinely believe that you need to get to a point where the executive functions at least develop past puberty and all those emotional changes that can occur before you go making such radical, potentially unchangeable, life-changing decisions. That's just my
sure. Yeah, and you're not alone in that opinion. It is interesting to look at the research, and so we should say that I don't think anywhere where transgender the identity is being recognized and worked with and medically, and psychologically supported, I don't think anywhere children are are being given permission to for surgery. That would be very a strong intervention.
Certainly, well,
but let me
young people have in England certainly been given drugs until the recent. They're now going to apparently withdraw giving such, and that's causing a lot of controversy in the trans community in England, as is Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling all over the internet. I'm not sure if you're aware. And many would say.
Okay, so we can talk about Rowling and Terps, trans exclusionary radical feminists. But let's finish our conversation first about treating children. And so by and large,
I do believe that emotional support should definitely be available without a doubt.
Yeah. So and for children, by and large, we're talking like 99% of the conversation, maybe 95% of the conversation for certainly prepubescent kids is just about psycho-emotional support.
Without a doubt, I'm 100% behind.
Yeah. And that takes different forms, right? That could be having access to mental health care, also support in public schools if they're wanting to socially transition, having schools and teachers that are trained and prepared to assist with that or to work with that. Being able to go by different kinds of names. I mean, there's all kinds of there's infrastructure as well that as part of that. And that's typically what we're talking about when we're talking about little kids, right? I think for most cisgender people, our imaginations go right to surgery. And that's what it means to be transgender. And so we think my kid is 2 years old, or my friend's kid is 2 years old. They want, and they're expressing different gender stuff. So I'm scared my friend's going to give that kid surgery, right, before they even have a chance to decide. And that's a valid fear. I mean, it's a valid concern that we don't want people to make life-changing decisions before they're actually able to make them with the age of consent or full awareness, right? Consent is a very big deal in all kinds of ways, but certainly in the medical and psychological establishment. But by and large, for little kids, we're not talking about surgery. We're not even talking about hormones or drugs. By and large, for little kids, it's just psycho-emotional support. But then when we get into pubescence, right? Again, it's very rarely are we talking about surgeries, but we're probably talking more about hormones or hormone blockers. And we talk about that in the book as well, like specifically what we're doing with those, or what our civilization is doing with those.
Yeah.
But there's two factors I want to lift up. One is that that none of these things are happening outside of a clinical diagnosis. And so people, in order to qualify for that kind of treatment, they have to have expressed transgender identity persistently, consistently, and insistently for a long time. Oftentimes they have to have socially transitioned. There's all kinds of qualifications, and so a diagnosis is not easy to get. And then also once that's gotten, they're monitored. There's protocols in place that are international protocols. So there's lots of really good medical science around the administration of hormones. And so, of course, a lot of things in childhood, like in the socially transitioning, all those can be undone, right? You can change your hair, you can unpierce your ears, you can, change your clothes without, there's not, change your name, your pronouns without any sort of repercussions. When we talk about hormone blockers, then we're putting that off for a few years to maybe postpone that decision until they feel like they're ready to have consent. That can't be postponed indefinitely because of bone density and other issues. So we need to experience some puberty, one or the other, right? And but then the question of hormone, which hormones we allow ourselves, which puberty we're going to go through, and some of those things can be reversed when you get off of hormone treatment. Some of them can't be, like breast development can't be undone just by stopping taking the hormones. facial hair doesn't go away just because you stop taking the hormones. Even if you're not growing new facial hair, you still need to, you still have those follicles that are active, things like that. So there's like there's like a more nuanced conversation about what constitutes irreversible changes or life-changing decisions. And then as we get older, of course, then as that progresses, then typically, at least in the US, conversations about surgeries and whatnot, those also need to have oftentimes a psychiatrist's several letters of recommendation before doctors will consider that. Right, so there's lots of fail safes and safeguards to protect people from making rash or undue decisions. Mm-hmm. Now, that having been said, so this is the other side of that, is that the research is actually really clear, like far more clear than I was expecting. I was expecting it to be like, like a little leaning this way, but it's like in the 90s percentile wise, and really high in the 90s, that when we follow longitudinal studies of children who have started these kinds of transitions at different rates in different places, that by far, most of them never want to go back. And all of the mental health markers are actually, they're higher in success, they're higher in stress management, they're higher in resilience and self-esteem, right? Living into the gender that they're identifying with. So when we look at the research, actually, it seems like we're doing a really good job. Like whatever the safeguards are, like to make sure that people aren't making rash decisions. By the time they're making those decisions, when they're starting them, even as through the point of hormone blockers, so around like 12 years old, depending 10 or 11, 12, depending on the development of the kid or the gender, the biological the sex they're identified with at birth, whether they have testes or ovaries, I guess is how I'm saying. Like depending on all those factors, when we're actually doing that work, we're clearly doing a good job, because the kids and the individuals, the adults, are happier that way than like speculatively they would have been otherwise. It's tough to say, definitively, because we don't have like a test, we don't have a control group of ourselves. We're only dealing with individuals. But when we look at the population as a whole, very rarely do people regret going on these treatments, and even more rarely do they decide to go back and back off of them. Yeah. So that's just like to lift that as informing our conversation about like our misgivings, or our cautions, our opinions in that way. When we look at the research, we can rest quite a bit more assured that the medical establishment is doing a good job monitoring that at present.
Sure. I mean, obviously, as with anything on this planet, there's always going to be the odd rogue somewhere, so some private surgeon who will take money off somebody if they have it. In a country where perhaps they can get away with doing things that they shouldn't, and sadly that happens in all walks of life. So bring a name up again, because we can't really, well, I don't feel we can really in this moment in time have this sort of conversation without chucking Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling's name into the equation, who is prolific on Twitter and social media, in a manner that everyone will have a different opinion, but I find, and I have no right to be offended on behalf of transgender people. So I have no right to be offended for other people. So I make that clear. But I personally find it offensive. But there again, why do I have a right to find it offensive when I'm not transgender? So I don't know what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that I've got connections on Twitter who are openly transgender. In fact, one of my Twitter connections, we've not met in real life as yet. We've only ever, it's only on Twitter, is a trans female, and has become a particular target of J.K. Rowling. A
Oh,
repeated target. Yeah, sadly. And I've seen this unfold, and I think the vast majority of the way it's been gone about by J.K. Rowling is bang out of order, but that's just my opinion. What do you make of it? 'Cause it doesn't help when you've got people in perceived positions of fame giving a misguided view or look on things. So by that, personally, what I mean is it is factually correct for somebody to state that a transgender or someone transitioning who identifies as female has been put into a female prison and then got done for raping some of the inmates because they still had their male physical equipment. And it's factually correct to state that when it has happened, which it has done, and then when it's been reported by the media. But just because that happened does not in any way, shape, or form correlate or mean that any other transitioning would ever do that if they were in the same position. All this nonsense about, should transitioning people use certain toilets or not comes up and gets twisted and distorted. And well, yeah, I'll hand to you. That's what I'm thinking about.
Sure.
Can you turn that into some
about the rape conversation? We really need to be clear. We kind of forget this, depending on when the conversation switches contexts, we have to start over with our with our learning. And we have to remember that rape is not primarily or even at all a crime about sex. It's a crime of power and assault. And so in those let's keep that in that kind of context, right?
Irrelevant from sexuality or gender is irrelevant.
Yes.
Whatever your sexuality or gender, those things can still do sometimes occur, because that's the world we live in.
Yeah. Well, and they're always rape is always bad, right? And rape is always bad not because of the gender identity of the person who does it. It's bad because
but unfortunately,
it's a crime of assault and power.
Media may give more headlines to certain perpetrators, which therefore clouds the public perception negatively.
Yes, yeah. So to talk about the J.K. Rowling and trans-exclusionary radical feminists, TERFs, they're often called. So for me, I mean, again, I'm like you, I'm a cisgender male, right? So what right do I have? But at the same time, I find it a fascinating sort of theoretical conversation. Not theoretical in the conversation is theoretical. It's conversation about theory, about gender identity and what it means, and particularly how it plays out in politics. Politics, not just exclusively parties and government, but the politics of the negotiations of power in life, in the world. And so when we're talking about that, and I don't think I can't remember how I mentioned J.K. Rowling in the book, but I'll say this first about what has become a problem around J.K. Rowling is that even if her first sort of initial post or feeling or belief or statement had it was not in itself so bad, it just tapped into a world of anxiety. But then her continued double downing on that, and maybe becoming defensive and then starting to attack other people. It's become a problem now, right?
India Willoughby, who is by definition of her own Twitter, so that I'm not misquoting. Although I'm pretty certain I remember correctly, but I don't want to misquote. So India. Okay. Search people. There we go. Broadcaster, world's first transgender newsreader. India Willoughby. On Twitter, you can find her. Unfortunately, she has become a repeated victim of direct attacks on X, Twitter, including to the point where India's had to report it to the police, but sadly they've the Scottish police as yet haven't acted upon such, as I understand it, in a manner that's just way out of order.
Yeah. Well, okay. So when we're talking about trans-exclusionary radical feminists, right? And I'm not one. I don't have like a lot of expertise in that area. So this is just so I'm sure you'll get comments on the video correcting or expanding what I'm about to say. But the my understanding is that their criticism of transgender identity is that I think probably adult trans women, they've been socialized male, and so they have enjoyed the benefits, the privilege of masculinity, of male, of privilege in placement, in preferential treatment in schools, and like the whole patriarchal infrastructure. And then they're being seen as like swooping in and wanting to assume this challenged identity, or this minority identity, even if like women are maybe not technically a minority, but they're like the minority identity of a disadvantaged population, and assuming that the positionality of a disadvantaged person just because they've changed their gender. Now, so and that's an interesting like conversation to have, right? I don't think it needs to be as venomous or as vehement as it's being had. I mean, it's an interesting theoretical construct, but it almost entirely misses the point that being transgender is itself a minority position. In fact, oftentimes, almost exclusively, or I mean, almost always, is multiple minority identities wrapped into one. And so it's not as if it's not as if they're coming from an entirely privileged position and assuming a non-privileged or a disadvantaged identity. So I think it's an interesting conversation to have. I think that J.K. Rowling has unfortunately done more harm to the conversation, to the ability to have the conversation, than helped it, just because of her vehemence, right? She's alienated a lot of people. Whereas, like, I think most people in the world, myself included, were predisposed to like to honor her opinion because of our love for the Harry Potter series, right? And then and she could have leaned into that and taken advantage of that, but instead went a different direction. Okay, then though, in the Harry Potter series, there's this great scene where Hermione and Harry and Ron, they take the polyjuice potion to change their bodies so they can infiltrate the other house and to like get secrets, solve the mystery, save the day. And one of them changes gender, right? So like I think it's Harry who might becomes a girl. But when J.K. Rowling talks about Harry, that character, she still uses the him pronoun, even though that character at that moment has vagina and breasts. So the outside of Harry is totally female, physically female, but she's still talking about his identity, him, the character, with the male pronouns. So implicitly, she understands the reality of transgender identity. I think that the sticking point might be for her, like politically, how that plays out when you're talking about feminism and women's rights, that sort of thing. So I think that, so I think so I think there might be a blurred line there that needs to be more clearly distinguished.
Yeah, and ideally an avoidance of victimizing individuals like, or as it looks as an outsider, victimizing individuals like India Willoughby, or emphasizing that newspapers said this, but not emphasizing the fact that actually, there are also straight or cis male and cis female rapist as well, rather than
Mm.
putting the focus. Fame is a form of power, and I don't think it should be abused to
Mm.
try and influence people's way of
Yeah.
thinking. And yet, scaringly, I'm about to say something that I know some viewers and listeners are going to go, ah, and they will. But contextually, somebody physically born male transitioning to female, suddenly getting involved in, say, swimming as a sport,
Mm.
suddenly has this massive advantage. And is it any wonder when they win? And that is something that has genuinely, definitely happened in England and other
Mm-hmm.
places. What are your thoughts on that? Because yes, whilst I'm 100% behind people being supported emotionally, physically, whatever they want, I do think that it becomes a bit unfair if your physicality of your body, because you didn't transition till later in life or whatever, is such that you are automatically got a massive advantage over everybody else.
So
Wise.
yeah, so that is it's a very, like, again, interesting conversation. It's very timely. It's very what's going on right now, right? And so I think it's important to sort of tease out the different strands of the conversation. Because one is that a lot of these issues are mobilized for political purposes, right? Whereas, like, so a parallel conversation in the United States is about voting security, or like the security of our voting system, right? And so there's all these measures that Republicans want to put in place to prevent voter fraud. Whereas, like, voter fraud happens very, very small percentage, like, insignificant, a number of times, a dozen times or so, in a country of 300 million people. But the laws themselves critically disadvantage a lot of communities and individuals of color, just because of the demands that that are made, right? So this issue, which is real in the sense that it exists, but not real in the sense that it's proportionately relevant, is being mobilized as the front for pushing other prejudices or strategic advantages, right? And so I think, to some extent, it's helpful to remember that in these conversations about transgender issues, that we have to be careful that we're not just buying into cultural apparatuses or institutions or communities, political parties or whatnot, right? Ideologies, putting these things out there as serious as they're saying they are, right? As critical a problem as they say they are. So that's sort of like the container for my answer, right? Because while it's an interesting conversation to have, I don't think it necessarily rises to the level of critical importance that other things do in our culture. I can understand, like, in competitive athletics, for people who really like spend their whole lives, or like that's their thing, right? That's their identity, is running or racing or relays or whatever, right? Swimming.
Yeah, I'm talking at like Olympic level or national, proper professional level.
Yeah. And so one of the other realities is that we need to remember that if somebody, like, maybe like we need to parse out qualifications like hormone levels, and like, how long have you had those hormone levels right now? Because it is true that testosterone is present in both female and male bodies, in both bodies with testes and ovaries. That testosterone, one of the effects that it has is larger muscle mass development. And there's more testosterone typically in a body with testes than in one with ovaries. Not that it's not present. I mean, ovaries produce testosterone as well, just not at the same level. So that's true that there's some clear hormonal advantages when you're talking about certain sports. And we also, I think we have laws in place that prevent people from taking hormone supplements for the purpose of this advantage in sports. And so maybe we need to qualify that as well as like make sure that like there's parity. And as long as the hormones are not being taken in order to establish a competitive edge, that they're actually conforming with their gender identity, then they might be allowed. They might have to have like a certain number of years that they've been on hormone treatment. So if someone is a trans woman, and let's say they transitioned later in life, in their 30s, right? So they've had years and years of bone density, muscle development, right? You know, like as a man, and presumably that whole time they've been in athletics, right? So really building that tone.
The example I'm thinking of, can't think of the name. I'm not going to bother searching, but yes, definitely it was a later in life. Well, they hadn't yet fully transitioned. They're just transitioning. But,
gotcha. Yeah. Well, see, and that's a valuable like conversation to have. Like, where's the line? When do we say, you know, like when do other people get to decide for someone where they get to compete, right? Because so like, yeah, I mean, those are all really interesting questions that we need to have as a civilization. And we need to like maybe dial down on more specifics. But we also need to remember that we're not mobilizing these things as disempowerment or criticism of like, or dismissal of transgender identity, right? Which is the way it ends up being played, right? Oh, like we can't have men competing in women's sports, right? Okay, and that's not what we're saying, right? These are not men. These are trans women. These are women, right? Who were born male or identified as male at birth, right? So they're not men. They're women. But we need to, but that's not the story that's being played, right? So it's being used as, this issue is being used as a way to erase.
It's a very difficult one, and yeah, it is so easily angled for people's political, personal, whatever agendas, and yeah, that's sad, and that goes on. But it is something that needs to be looked at. This is a devil's advocate one. Making that clear, because I don't want to look like Mr.
I hope I'm not like going on at too great a length with these answers.
No, this is absolutely brilliant. Look, if we're gonna have a bloody hypnosis week about a book called Transgender, working with transgender clients in a professional hypnosis practice, then covering these surrounding things, it would be remiss not to, frankly. One that jumps in is, obviously this is only a case of you notice what you see, obviously, and then if you keep seeing things, that's what you take as being normal, and it isn't necessarily. The truth of the matter is the minority of people who transition probably once they have transitioned, they probably don't mention it. There are people though who, and there's no reason why they shouldn't, quite proudly make mention of the fact that they are, for example, like India Willoughby, the world's trans presenter, that area of broadcasting that she works in. But that then is labelling yourself, I'm trans. But she's, as far as I'm concerned, she's a female. Simple as, right? But if she wants to let people know that she wasn't female at birth, obviously that's up to her. Unfortunately, there are nasty people out there who go searching for photographs of before she transitioned and post them. And I think that's probably like water off a duck's back to her now, because with all this rowling stuff.
I would hope, but it still could be very traumatizing.
But it shouldn't be happening, sadly. That shouldn't be happening. And people make their own decisions. But I do wonder sometimes, and some people out there, that's why it's a devil's advocate question, not me. Why, when you've transitioned and gone through all the potential pain, suffering, emotional issues, as well as physical related things, and finally have reached the destination you want to be, or becoming, for example, a female body. You've always had the female mind and feelings. You've now got the matching body. Surely that's the point where you've got to the destination you wanted to be, and you should just live your life as the female you always felt you were and have now become and will continue to be, Why does why does there seem to be this need to go, I'm trans, which is alerting people to the fact that you were born with a different physical body than you've now got? Surely, great. Wouldn't it be easier just to live life as the person you become and wanted to become?
Yeah, so this is a really good topic. And you'd be surprised at the difference that this generally plays in different generations. There's generational aspects because I mean there's trans people of all kinds of ages, right? And for a great many transgender people who are older, they that is the goal is to, it's called passing, right? I mean, like, to just live your life without being questioned, right? And without having your transgender identity up front, but living the gender identity that you identify with, right? And just living your life fully that way. Because for older generations in the past, there was only the binary, right? There was one or the other. So if you weren't one, you had to be the other, right? And so they've lived their whole lives into that binary, and so the ideal was to make that switch, to have that switch be the publicly presumed one, right? So for a lot of older generations, that actually is the goal, is to just live your life, just be your person, right? Then when we get younger, like middle-aged now, there's also similar, not dissimilar to the gay lesbian community, where there's a strong sense of advocacy, and that being part of how they deal with the stresses of coming out, of discerning their identity, of confronting infrastructure and structures of dynamics of power, of prejudice and oppression, right? Part of the way they deal with that is actually leaning into that identity, reclaiming it, not as something bad, but as something good. Like the whole queer label is now being, that label's being reclaimed, whereas it used to be a slur, now it's embraced. Whereas being gay was something that you hid, now it's something that's to be celebrated in pride parades, right? And so part of the identity, I think, for younger generation, middle-aged, like people who are middle-aged now, typically, even if we're living within that binary, where we're either one or the other, we want the ability that, like, our identity as not just clearly one or the other, to be part of the message we give as a way to support younger people. But then as we go even get younger and younger, people who are maybe beginning college now, sometimes in high school right now, they have not been raised with the same binary idea that most of us have, right, for generations. And maybe it's because of our culture's sort of more broadly accepted sort of sense now of gender or sexual orientation, right, and gender expression, and maybe media, maybe the internet and the passage of the accessibility of gender expansive role models or clothes or assisted prosthetics, whatever. I know part of it is in the United States, at least in the Pacific Northwest. Part of it is the result of a really, I mean, aggressive, I want to say, but a really proactive anti-bullying curriculum or component of the curriculum, right? And so that's been so now, I'm Gen X, so I grew up with bullying. That's just how the world worked. And but now kids, bullying is very, even if they disagree, bullying is it's very not tolerated. And so there's no fat shaming, there's no body shaming, right? So now kids, kids I know in junior high and high school, they might be teased, they might be, they might feel insecure or whatnot, but their gender identity is not questioned. That's not, their pronouns are not, nobody misuses the pronouns. That's not tolerated, right? So the younger generations now have this explosion of sort of freedom around that. And so they're not necessarily stuck in the binary even, and they're leaning into sort of the experimental identity of anywhere, it's not even like a spectrum anymore. It's more like a three-dimensional field where you might not identify as primarily masculine or primarily feminine. You might be agender, not a gender, but atypical or atheist, right? Like agender, not agender, right? Or some other identity where that becomes, and as identity is so performative for teenagers anyway, right? It becomes part of how they move into the world. And I don't know if that's advocacy or just them playing with identity or only having a limited number of ways, as young people do, to express themselves, right? So it comes out in clothes and language and hairstyles like that. But for them, for transgender people or people who are non-binary, that becomes part of their identity. Because I think at the beginning they're establishing that difference, right? And so they're swimming against the tide. That having been said, it seems to me, in my experience with younger people, that after a few years, after like 7 or 8 years of living in that identity just becomes just who they are, right? And it becomes less of a thing that they talk about. Now, that may not be all. That's not universal. That's just my own anecdotal experience. So I guess like the non-answer I'm giving you is that it's actually everybody's their own individual, but it actually varies. There's broad trends that are different in different generations, because also earlier generations didn't have access to hormone treatments or surgical treatments until very late. People who are my age had those more available, so now they can pass much more easily.
Right? We're dealing with human beings here, so there is never ever going to be one definitive right or wrong answer. We've got to bear that in mind. And I played devil's advocate along the way a bit, but this has been a fascinating conversation. Now, we've not got much time left. So there's a couple of things I want to point out now to everyone viewing and listening again, that below this video or below the audio speaker on the audio podcast, there will be a link for the book on screen, Transgender, Working with Transgender Clients in the Professional Hypnosis Practice. A book that, whilst I've not fully finished reading it, every single word, I have had a good speed read and read some areas in depth. And there are techniques in there as well. It's not just, we've talked about different thoughts, philosophies, and facts and figures and that kind of stuff. But there are actual, this is what you could do to help clients in that sort of situation. And in that regard, I'm going to ask your opinion on this. It's just a thought I had looking at the book and stuff, and that is, I do a lot of idiomotor response work with clients. So I'm talking to your unconscious mind now, blah blah blah, the sort of thing, and we're going to assign that finger to be a finger twitches yes, this finger's no, that one's maybe, might be as simple as that. Now, that's all well and good when I'm dealing with a cis male or female, somebody who identifies as that, they were born with, because I know that I can go, talking to your unconscious, Christian's unconscious mind now. I'd like you to just let me know, is there any reason why Christian's conscious mind and unconscious mind should not allow him to move forward and leave this office today as the confident, happy, healthy, with or whatever it is. No, there's no issue. Fine, then we can do. Oh, yes, there is. Okay. So you get the idea. But with somebody who is transitioning or has transitioned, where the root cause of their habit, addiction, fear, or phobia, if that's what they're there for, maybe was triggered off, started when they were, before they transitioned into as they identified as. So let's say a trans female comes to get over a spider phobia, and that spider phobia was instilled and anchored at an early age, 6, 7, maybe seeing the mum scream at 1, or if whatever, it doesn't matter what it was, but it happened when they were still trapped in a male body. For some people, it may be, obviously the easy answer to this is ask them in advance. I get that, and I know you're probably going to say that. What I'm getting at is, for some people, it will be more appropriate to say to, the client in front of you, Sharon, I'm talking now to your unconscious mind. I'm talking to that part of you that can remember being Jamie or whatever. And can you just ask that part of you that was Jamie if it would be appropriate today to let go of all those thoughts, feelings, energies, emotions, or connections or triggers that used to bother you in the past and used to set off that reaction to spiders? Whereas for some other people, that could totally not work and you still want to communicate everything as communicating with Sharon. What are your thoughts on that, in particular to parts therapy? Because that was a part of their life.
Yeah. Yes. So this is a great question. This is a really good question. And of course, you're right. The basic answer is like, let the client lead. Ask the client, like ideally in advance if you know that's going to happen, but sometimes you don't. You might even ask them in the session. But also, I find that as a matter of of practice when doing parts therapy or even age regressions with that using the name is actually less helpful than using the descriptive, like what's important about that identity or that part, that iteration of them, like whether it's the age, like I want to talk to 7 now, when like 7, and then don't even like use pronouns. 7, how are you feeling? Like, and then like talking to Sharon, how does 7 feel about that, right? Or if it is the experience of being in the closet and there's like a spider web on the kid, right? On him at that time, but and like just okay, like in the closet, spider, right? Or in the closet in the web. Sharon, how does in the closet feel, right? So it's more reifying for the part to be connected with that descriptor, which then also gives us the ability to implicitly shift the identification of that. When that part has released whatever that issue is, then we can change the name of the part, right? So now it's the burden-free part, or the healed part, or the confident part, or the part that can squish a spider in its fingers, or something like whatever it is, right? Because then we're reinforcing that shift. So yeah, so I guess that'd be my ideal answer, right? Is actually like eschew the idea of pronouns altogether and go for something that connects more directly with that experience. Okay, that all having been said, I don't know if you're really wanting me to like give an answer, right? I would say, like, push me, don't let me off the hook, right? So typically, and there's some conversation about this among transgender. I've heard it both from transgender clinicians themselves, like, and in their own experience and working with clients. I've heard it that they might have known that they were a certain gender before they transitioned, right? And so they would prefer to use that pronoun for most of their lives, if not all their lives, right? And it's important for them to sort of retroactively affirm that identity into their early childhood. And so at that point, we would just use their current pronoun and read it into the past. It's also been told to me, read it in research, that it's helpful with previous iterations to refer to them to the gender identity they had at the time. So like sometimes if like if it was a boy at 7, like how does he feel, right? Or how does Jamie feel, right? And so I've heard it cast both ways. And here's the rub, of course. It probably depends on how that person thinks of their identity now. If they're really secure, if they're nuanced, if they have experience with parts therapy, or they've had like therapy like for a long time, they've come to sort of like acknowledge there's different parts of themselves, or like, then they might be more open to those conversations about having, or more open to having different pronouns being used. If it's still somewhat new, or if they really feel like they've had to struggle to establish that identity, then having that identity reaffirmed by using their current pronoun retroactively, that's fine too, right? So I guess my real answer would be, don't deal with the question of pronouns at all. It's actually better for the client and better for the technique if you use identifiers that correspond with whatever's like the most important thing is happening right then.
Excellent. Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, or whatever you should be,
and everything in between
Or
and
as
around.
my daughter wrote me a gag for my stage hypnosis show for certain venues. Not the funniest thing, but it gets a bigger laugh than you perhaps think it would. Ladles and jelly spoons, or whatever item of cutlery in the drawer you may identify.
I love it. I love it.
Anyway,
I may
thank you.
steal that. I may steal that from you.
Please do. Christian, it's been an absolute. I'm looking forward to reading the rest of Transgender, working with transgender clients in a professional hypnosis practice. I would recommend, even if as a therapist you have no desire to specifically niche into that area, the fact is, sooner or later, you may naturally get somebody come to you and having read this book would stand you in good stead. Or it may just be from a personal point of view that you are respectful enough to yourself as a human being to explore life through other people's eyes and experiences. Whatever your motive, you can only benefit by having a read of the book. So follow the links below this video or the audio speaker and connect with Christian Skoorsmith. And sir, thank you very much indeed for your time. I hope I didn't put you on the spot too much with some of those devil's advocate questions, but thank you.
I really appreciate your willingness to be uncomfortable and to play an uncomfortable role for the sake of having a genuine conversation. I really do appreciate it. It's been a genuine joy, and thank you so much. I'm very appreciative of just the opportunity to have these kind of conversations. So thanks so much.
Thank you. This will be going live on the World Wide Web on the 5th of June 2024. As always, nothing will have been edited out. This conversation is exactly as you see or hear it on Hypnosis Week. From me, Alex Smith, aka John Hypnosis, it's goodbye from me and goodbye from Christian. Thank you very much indeed, sir. You've been a star.
Thank you so much.
But ladies and gentlemen, you know we say that this is a recorded as live show. It is. That would have been the perfect point to cut then, but I couldn't find the stop recording bit. But this time it genuinely is. Goodbye from both of us. See you on the next edition of Hypnosis Week. Please comment below the video, share this video, and go and grab a copy of the book. Bye for now.